Hi, welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. And joining me on today's show is John Harney. Hey, John, how's quarantine life treating you?
It's okay, Bob. It's all right. I will say that the endless Zoom meetings, I'm better at them because I'm used to talking to people remotely. Nobody else is used to it.
Good.
So that's been the one, that's the one silver lining I have.
You've got a lot of experience with that. Yeah. So on today's episode, we'll be discussing the reveal of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is set in and around the North Sea during the 9th century at the height of the so-called Viking Age. And the game is set to be released later this year, knock on wood, and will appear on current generation consoles, next generation consoles, and on PC through the Ubisoft Store and the Epic Store, which is a kind of a huge get for Epic, which is kind of escalating its war against Steam. So today we got the cinematic trailer for the game, which depicted kind of stereotypical Viking stuff. There was a Viking raid of an English coastal settlement. And the trailer had all the hallmarks of recent Assassin's Creed games, including ships, blood, gore, kings, gods, mythology, and then at the end, of course, a hidden blade. So we've got a ton to discuss about this trailer, about the reveal from the game from Ubisoft. But John, I wanted to start with you and ask you, what did you make of this reveal?
I wasn't shocked it was Vikings. How long has it been common knowledge to be Vikings? Every 6 months?
I'd say 6 months. That sounds about right.
Yeah. At the same time, I really liked it. I thought it was pretty cool. We can go on to talk about it in more detail. It's very kind of a historically revisionist view. Like they're going to great pains to present the Vikings a certain way, which we'll definitely talk more about because I think that it kind of goes too far the other direction. But it looks amazing.
Yes.
I mean, it looks fantastic. It looks beautiful. Like, and all the individual faces of the various humans look amazing. But I liked it. But I liked the small touches as well, like Alfred the Great, and I'm assuming some kind of Templar worm tongue type figure. I'm not really sure where they're going with that. But no, so my initial reaction was, God, this looks great. And I enjoyed Odyssey a lot. And I like the period Odyssey is set in and everything, but Valhalla is very, very exciting.
Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, I think, like you mentioned, this trailer and the kind of reveal information we've gotten from Ubisoft about the game so far, it really fits in with what you might call the recent hallmarks of the Assassin's Creed series, basically from, let's say, Black Flag, definitely since Origins to this point. You've got a setting in the distant past, so this is in the Dark Ages, so-called Dark Ages. You've got a time period that's really famous for conflict, and then a period that is also marked by a lot of mythology, and I would say also, with regards to historical memory, a lot of mythologizing as well. And it's also a period, this is a period after the fall of Rome, where you've got a lot of divisions throughout Northern Europe, not only in Norway and Denmark, where the Vikings, so-called Vikings, are coming from, but then also in England itself, where you've got divisions within the Anglo-Saxon tribes, and then the remaining Britons and Romans who are there. But in all of that conflict and all of that history, there's not much in the way of historical record. So you've got kind of a blank canvas, to deal with, which is kind of fertile territory historically for the Assassin's Creed series. And then kind of mechanically, you've also got a setting that allows for a lot of opportunity for travel on land and sea. Ubisoft has kind of become not only the developer of towers, but then also of ocean fighting, of sea fighting. And so it makes sense from a mechanical kind of game playing standpoint to have this setting because of, Viking launch ships and raiding and whatnot. And yeah, I think I'm not surprised either that this is the setting for the new Assassin's Creed. We've heard a lot about rumors about this in the past 6 months or so. I would say that it does seem a little bit risky in the sense that there has been a lot of Viking video games in the past few years. Most notably, God of War delved into Viking mythology, Norse mythology, for its most recent game, which was critically acclaimed, won a bunch of Game of the Year awards. You also had another critical darling game called Hellblade, which did similar things, not to the same kind of grandiose level as God of War, but still delving into Norse mythology. And I would say that maybe there's a risk of Viking burnout. And, from just a general standpoint, looking in particular at the most recent Assassin's Creed games, I'm surprised still that they haven't gone with Rome instead. It seemed like a more natural fit when you consider Origins was ancient Egypt and then Odyssey, ancient Greece. It just kind of felt like we were going to get a kind of Greco-Roman game to tie that all off. But, still, I think there's plenty of opportunity with this game with Valhalla, and I think, it fits in well with the mechanics that have been established by the recent Assassin's Creed games.
Yeah, something that struck me watching the trailer for the first time is just, what an institution Assassin's Creed is at this point, which of course isn't news, right? But if you had told me when Assassin's Creed 4 was a new game that the naval combat would basically be a mainstay of all the main games going forward, I probably would have been happy because it worked really well in that game, but I don't think I would have believed you. Do you know what I mean? Because it just felt so specific to that game.
Yeah.
And then they brought it into all these games since. And then the meta thing makes me think of the FIFA World Cup, the Soccer World Cup, where they used to do one tournament for the Europeans, one tournament for South Americans, and they would bip and bop it between continents, And Ubisoft has to have a long-term plan. And like you say, Rome seemed like a natural next step. But I guess maybe they're thinking Rome is always there for them. I don't know. Yeah. If anything, it's a conversation you and I had years ago when Red Dead Redemption came out, and I've mentioned it a few times in this podcast, of wouldn't it be awesome if Rockstar just did random historical games every now and again? Assassin's Creed has become that, to the point where, as much as the whole "he's an assassin," which obviously wasn't shocking, reveal, it was cool in the moment. It was very, very well done. I'm sitting there going, yeah, but I don't care about any of that. That's what I care about the least, is the sci-fi patina of whatever the hell. Who even knows what's going on at this point?
Dan Brown / Arthur C. Clarke, whatever you want to call it.
But even whatever it is, I mean, even in Odyssey, the whole underground, the Atlantis, whatever you want to call it, stuff. The worst part of it was I had to sit through some randomly weird, conversation with somebody in the present. Why? I don't care. So that's interesting to me. That for me at least, and I suspect, I hope I'm going to like this. I loved the trailer. More than ever, I'm tolerating the kind of, may he rest in peace, Desmond-centric, or I guess it isn't, I don't care anymore.
Hashtag never forget.
Animus involved.
Never forget, John. Well, I think it's funny. Yeah. I mean, you come from that angle. I am still kind of into the sci-fi elements of it. I have to admit, it's been difficult as a fan of that part of the series these past few games, but, it seems like from early conversations, early news coming out of Ubisoft that they are going to try to make more of that modern era stuff going forward. But I think, what interests me the most about this game is not only the setting, but then also the kind of modern day political implications for that setting. So, in the trailer and in the kind of the basis for the game, you've got the Viking raids, which were brought on by kind of political, economic instability in Scandinavia and Denmark, during this time period, during the so-called Dark Ages. And so you've got raids that are coming out of Norway and Denmark in particular, and it's partly about attempting to find resources to continue to survive, but then also to set up settlements in England to live. And so I think you are it would be difficult for you to play this game. And I haven't played it yet, but I think it would be difficult for you to look at this trailer and play this game and not think about, the Syrian refugee crisis. And then also, because of the setting of the game, it's set in England for the most part, where the Viking raids took place. It's hard not to think of Brexit as well. And on top of all that, you've got a lot of kind of interesting historical memory issues. You've got age-old historical debates about the Vikings, the Viking raids, and their place in history and historical memory. The very term Viking is a very controversial term because it's a kind of a catch-all crutch term used to kind of demarcate a whole assortment of different groups of people from Norway and Denmark. And the same thing goes for England at this point. There's kind of I guess what you could, an undertow of historical memory that's written through this trailer related to England and how important the Viking raids were to English mythology, or not necessarily mythology, but the myth making around the creation of England as a state, as a nation, and how important the Viking raids were to that idea, right? You could say English nationalism, and this has been an argument that's been made many times, English nationalism started with the Viking raids, right? A rejection of the Vikings, right. And, kind of a rallying around Alfred the Great. And a lot of that same sort of idea, the historical memory of that, the symbology, the iconography of that history has been regurgitated recently with Brexit. So I think I'm personally a little disappointed they didn't go with Rome, but I think given what I've just gone over, I think there's a lot of meat on the bone for people interested in discussing this time period, and also a lot for this game to delve into, not only with the game itself, but then also the kind of discourse around the game.
Well, I mean, I feel it's important for me to point out, and I've held back this long, that the game is doing something right, because the English are the bad guys. So that's correct. That's the correct view. It also fits the certain kind of cinematic Hollywood style of the game too. There's you get to have these English sounding people as bad guys. No, I think that's a great point. I think it's funny we're talking about Rome so much because I've been reading about Rome. I've been reading Mary Beard's SPQR, which is excellent. And if anybody who doesn't know who Mary Beard is interested in the history of Rome, you need to read things that she's written, because she's a wonderful writer and she's a very, very good historian. And at this point in the book, the Romans get to a point where they see themselves as this global, world-conquering force of nature and everything. But early on, like 3rd century, 2nd century BCE, they're probably aren't there yet. It's disputed. Beard argues they aren't there yet. And her only real answer, which I think is a good one, is that the Mediterranean was a mess. We're applying to like the 3rd century BCE Rome ideas that both make more sense now and made more sense in the 2nd century AD or CE. And it made more sense to Romans in the 1st and 2nd century CE. So, for example, I'm thinking of Vikings and even present-day Scandinavian self-imagery. You think of, when I teach the samurai, I talk about this all the time. The Japanese engage in the myth-making as much as anybody else does, So I think that's kind of, I think that's fascinating. I think the trailer has a lot of kind of, the English king saying these terrible things about them, but they didn't kill children. When they probably did, not because they're bad people, but just because, it was the 9th century. It's not like you don't have to go back very far for that to be fairly common.
Yeah.
And the truth is that the whole Viking term I think is 18th century or something, and it's funny because this whole thing of the Vikings either being these savages or noble savages, that's actually dichotomy going back a couple hundred years.
Oh,
so
yeah. For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, like we've all grown up, but I'm sure many of the classic thing, right, that they didn't wear horned helmets. Although I understand customization's a big thing in this game, so I guess hopefully you can have a horned helmet if you really want it. But if you're feeling Wagnerian, but this notion, oh, they weren't really like X, they weren't really like Y. Well, yeah, they weren't really like A or B either, or well, they might have been. We don't know. So, for example, maybe they're inseparable from what the Romans were 1,000 years earlier in 150 BC, right? Maybe there were lots and lots of similarities. Like, but of course, in the present day, and going back to the early years of cinema, the Romans are always played by English actors pontificating, looking somewhere off stage, Shakespearean, right?
Yeah.
Andronicus becomes, and so on and so on. Whereas the Vikings, we've graduated from kind of roaring savages and opera to, sexy Vikings on TV, which is a more recent development.
What channel is that on?
The History Channel. So it's so I was fascinated by that, and I kind of love that they kind of dove right into it, because the first kind of half of the trailer, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, sure, why not have this revisionist view of the Vikings? Like, what's the harm, kind of thing. But I don't know. I'm intrigued to see where they go with it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of historical revisionism, that is kind of fertile ground for the Assassin's Creed series. It has been since they started. Anytime you get a moment where one historical group is demonized and the other is valorized, that's kind of a good spot for an Assassin's Creed game, because, the whole thing with the Assassin's Creed story is that, well, the history isn't true, and the bad guys were actually the good guys, and the good guys were actually incredibly evil, right? And I think you get a lot of that from watching this trailer. I mean, it is almost a perfect distillation of Assassin's Creed historical revisionism, and I think that is something to be excited about, right? Because they're kind of sticking to their roots in a very fictionalized narrative sense, but it's also something to keep in mind for more historically minded players. When you're playing these games, this game itself, it is a history of the past, right? Even if it is filled with all kind of mythology and, horned helmets and downloadable content and whatnot. But it's also one that is taking a particular argument about the past, and it is revising. You might even say it's probably revising a revision in and of itself. And so, it's something you want to take with a grain of salt, even though you are perhaps eager to jump into this playground and play around with. So, yeah.
Well, I thought you're making a great point, and more, thinking about it. One of the things I like about not just Assassin's Creed series, but all games that do these things well. So the fight scene at the end of the trailer felt very Game of Thrones to me. The mountain type figure showing up, but it works very well cinematically. But there is this language of an English king, right?
Yeah.
And these people have been, you might think they were savages, but actually were quite sophisticated. It's like, well, actually, and going back to Beard's point about Mediterranean 1,000 years earlier, it was a mess. There's no England at this point, of course, as you well know, Bob, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is the time of Beowulf-ish, right? This is kind of the Angles and the Saxons. It's all a bit messy. When I went to college 20 years ago now, an historian got up on the rostrum in front of 400 of us and explained that the English like to talk about the Viking conquest of Ireland, but it never happened, whereas the Vikings did conquer England. And that's true. But what the Vikings did do is they founded almost all of Ireland's main cities on the coast, including Dublin, the capital. And the reason they didn't conquer Ireland was that Irish politics made England look unified by comparison, and it was just too much, too difficult, and maybe it was too inconvenient. We're not sure. That was, but a lot of Europe was like that, and maybe the game will delve into that kind of an idea, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't kill them on it. I mean, they've got to make a game. It's got to work. It's got to work at some point, especially with the Templars assassin overlay. And I'll be honest, I mean, I love sci-fi as a whole. I've just lost track of what the heck is going on. But when they have the Templar assassins overlay, they need to have some sense and of these kind of groups, factions, I guess. And another part of it, I suppose, is that, and I think I've read this somewhere, that it's definitely happening. I'm assuming it's a continuation of some of the kind of war mechanics you saw in Odyssey.
Yes.
Therefore, you have to have the English or the Mercians or whatever you're going to call them. versus the Norsemen or the Danes or whatever.
Mercians, nice deep cut there, John. That's great.
Well,
Yeah, well,
I do
good,
play a lot of Crusader Kings too, so.
good little Irish nationalist historical argumentation going on here. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the mechanics, because things are changing up a little bit. Kind of a web page open here from GameSpot, and they've got a lot of good resources about the game. They've got, in particular, an interview with Darby McDivitt, who is the narrative director for this game. And McDivitt is actually somebody that I saw talk at GDC back in 2017. And he's a very well-spoken guy, very interested in historical games. And he's got an interview here on GameSpot in which he kind of delves into the history, what he's trying to get at with the story, and then also getting a little bit into how that plays into the mechanics. And then they've got another article here on GameSpot about just kind of wrapping up all of the details from the trailer, as well as promotional information about the mechanics from Ubisoft. And I don't want to sound like I'm becoming a shill for GameSpot, but I do think these articles are really handy because it gives you a little quick snippet of what you're looking for with the details from the game. And one of the things that stood out to me was that the developers are leaning into the RPG elements of the game, and in particular attempting to build up those RPG elements that you saw in Origins, that you saw in Odyssey. They're doing that primarily through the inclusion of a settlement. So this is like a camp that you build up, you look after, and you upgrade over the course of the game. And in the settlement, you'll be able to participate in activities, and they've got them listed here: fishing, hunting, dice, and drinking games. So this sounds a little bit like what you were talking about earlier, Assassin's Creed sort of becoming not just like The Witcher, but becoming more like Red Dead, right? In particular, Red Dead Redemption 2, where you had your base camp and, you went back to it and you could upgrade it and everything. And it does seem like in that setting, you could have more RPG elements, not just upgrading and the doling out of attribute points or something like that, but then also conversations with other characters.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been playing a lot of Animal Crossing, so it's very appealing to me. It's kind of an idea of like an Animal Crossing sphere. No, I think it's interesting. It's fascinating. You see this in so many areas. You see it in sports a lot, for example. Like soccer is my favorite sport, where 4-3-3 kind of came in with Barcelona a few years ago, and now basically everybody plays 4-3-3, and that's just it's a formation in soccer. Sorry if people who don't know. But when things start to work, the obvious thing to do is to emulate that. And the bigger a video game gets, as we both know, the more moving parts are involved, the more difficult, it's a very hoary analogy really, but, moving a battleship is a lot harder than moving a skiff kind of thing, or, turning a skiff. And so you start seeing this building on ideas. But I'm fascinated by this trend because you're seeing it. Red Dead's a great example, but you see it in lots and lots of small games. I'm trying to think, or smaller games, I should say. Like the Pathfinder game that came out a year ago with this isometric RPG, Baldur's Gate style, but on the Pathfinder series, that had that idea, where you had your own kind of city type thing. In fact, a couple of those isometric games have been doing it, and people joke about crafting coming into everything kind of thing, which is already happening in Assassin's Creed. But it is fascinating to me. And I'm curious to see how they'll do it, because they're on such a good run, I think, in my opinion. I think Origins and Odyssey have both panned out way better than I thought in both cases ahead of time. Well, maybe before Origins. I think the RPG stuff, I guess it has been jarring, but everyone's just kind of gone with it.
It's the new normal now.
Yeah.
A phrase which we hear all the time. But I would say what's been the most remarkable thing to me about the Assassin's Creed series, just stepping back and looking at it as a game series, is how well they've adapted the game over the past decade or so, because it debuted in 2007.
Yeah.
And, when you think about game series, going back to the early 80s, it's very often the case that you have a game series have 3 or 4 successful titles, and then all of a sudden it falls apart, right? And everything collapses. And that could very well have happened to Assassin's Creed, but it didn't. And it's remarkable that they've managed to a large extent, remake the whole game, remake the whole idea of the series, and yet still be successful. I mean, it is still a third-person action game, but at the same time, the older versions were simple mission-based, games in which you were assassinating people based on stealth. And now, with the most recent games, it's really more like a third-person RPG, like The Witcher. And to hear that they're adding in settlements, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a natural progression for what they've been building upon with Origin and Odyssey.
What fascinates me about it as well is the extent to which Ubisoft kind of just created the Ubi game idea almost, because as you say, those early games, I've said it before, it's not news to anybody. The last half hour of the first Assassin's Creed game is just terrible. It's just awful after what it was a really, really fun, game before that.
Yeah.
But in those early games, like in between the missions, you'd run around and jump up to the top of buildings and everything else. And then you had this cross-pollination in various Ubisoft games. I'm thinking of Far Cry as well, of this idea, the outpost idea, kind of drifting in between these different game series and everything else. So now, sure, if one of the designers of the game was sitting here with us, they could say to us, oh, you still do, you still unlock vision and you still do all these things. Like, yeah, but it feels completely different.
Yeah.
It's just a completely different game. Like, I never finished Odyssey because I just got distracted doing other things, which you could kind of do in Assassin's Creed 2 and 3, but it's not to the same extent.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the whole idea of a side mission is really antithetical to the previous history of Assassin's Creed. If you're thinking about AC 1, 2, and 3, and to a certain extent 4, you had the idea of memory synchronization, right? So you would have that's right. You would have certain side missions, but they would be all a part of this straight line campaign that you would start and you would finish. Whereas by the time you get to Origins and then Odyssey in particular, it's all open-ended, and there is a main campaign, but you don't necessarily have to interact with it, and you have these fully fleshed out subplots through these side quests that you can do, and you can completely avoid the main campaign if you want to. It's remarkable. It's crazy. Honestly, if you were to introduce, the first Assassin's Creed to players who had only played Origins or had only played Odyssey, I don't know what they would make of it. I don't know if they'd like it.
I mean, to keep our meta historians kind of hat on as well, it's just, you have to give Ubisoft respect for just consistently pumping out, at the very least, acceptable games. I'm not sure, you'll know better than I will now. What are considered some of the weaker ones? Is Syndicate considered a weaker one or not? I know you like Syndicate.
Oh, I really loved Syndicate mainly because of the time period.
but that was kind of my point. Like even the so-called weaker Assassin's Creed games have more than enough champions because they're doing something consistently. Like, they haven't had a stinker. Like,
I'd say the closest one they got was AC Unity, which was the one set during the French Revolution.
And that had bugs and other technical problems.
That had a lot of technical problems, but I think the core game, outside of those problems, was pretty good, and I think the multiplayer did some interesting things, but there's not going to be a multiplayer mode with this game. There wasn't one with Odyssey and Origin, so I think they've kind of shied away from that, which I think, just as an aside, I think is really unfortunate, because I think those familiar with the multiplayer mode in AC, I think it started in AC 3, it was definitely in 4, will remember it was pretty original in its take. It's kind of hard to describe now, but good multiplayer mode, but they haven't done it in years now.
And they're always going to have such a huge player base, they can kind of put these things in there. But I don't mean to be rude, but like Fallout 76 is just a bad game. It's just terrible. It's just awful. And the Fallout series, which theoretically looked invincible, like it's you can like really talented people who really want to make a really good game can fall short. Like that's a pretty
Mm-hmm.
common thing to happen. And then stuff that most of us aren't paying attention to behind the scenes of people moving on to other opportunities, teams changing, relationships, like human relationships, like team changing and everything else. It's kind of astonishing that Ubisoft is consistently managing it. Now I hope I'm not jinxing them, and I don't. Valhalla looks great, but it's amazing. And all they do is every couple of years they just take a year off. Like these games are coming out a lot. Like the Elder Scrolls games are all good, but they come out every like 12 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's remarkable. And so we'll see what the future has in store for Valhalla. I hope that we hear something about a new Discovery Tour mode, which is something they did for Origins and for Odyssey. Again, I still wonder how well that Discovery Tour mode is doing for them financially, or if that's even the point. I don't know. But it's something I definitely enjoyed. And I think with each installment of that, definitely with Odyssey, I thought this is something you could actually use in a classroom setting. So I'd be curious to see what kind of improvements they've made. If they are planning on doing a Discovery Tour mode, what kind of improvements they make on top of that for a potential Discovery Tour mode for Valhalla. But we'll see. I don't know. Any other last thoughts about Valhalla?
I just, to reiterate, I thought the trailer looked great, and fingers crossed. I wish the best to everybody involved. It looks like it was a good call right now.
Yeah.
I'm excited, and yeah, looked amazing. I gotta keep going to that. I kind of excited now to see what the actual in-game stuff looks like.
Yeah.
Because it looks stellar, and now I know this is brutally unfair because the trailer for the new game just came out today, but I really want to know what the next one is. The next Assassin's Creed game. Like if they have an internal roadmap, they'd obviously be insane to share it publicly, but I would love to see it. I'd love to just get a sense of what's coming next, the Zulus. Okay. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah. My best guess would be Rome. I've been saying that for a couple of years now, but the reason why I think it will be Rome is that if you go and look up some of the kind of extra material, publicity material for this new game, Valhalla, on Ubisoft's website, and then also read this Darby McDivitt interview that he did on GameSpot, he reveals that, and the Ubisoft material reveals that the team that worked on Valhalla, at least narratively, was the same team that worked on AC4, Black Flag. And they also did a little bit of the kind of narrative design for Origins, but they didn't do all of the work for that. So if you were to, say, step back and look at it from a game development standpoint, this team has been working on this idea for many years. We could guess basically since Origins started. And so then that means that the team that did Origins, which included so much of the material, not just on Egypt, but then also a little bit on Rome, that team has probably been working on a new game. And so that makes me think that is going to be Rome. That's my guess. But I think there's some basis to that idea.
It could be a huge head fake, and it could be the Holy Roman Empire. It could be, 30 Years War,
Barbarossa,
Assassin's Creed.
yeah.
They're not going to do that.
No.
I think a game set in the 30 Years War would be the whitest, most Eurocentric game you could make. In the current climate, I just don't see that happening.
And an absolute field day for online white supremacists as well.
Yeah, sadly. Yes.
Another one that I hope they do, and it is kind of well-trodden territory by video games at this point, but I think, Japan, medieval Japan would be a great setting for an Assassin's Creed game. But we'll wait and see. We still have to get Valhalla first. But I wish them well. I hope everything goes well with the final developments, especially with everything going on regarding the virus. Same goes for you, the listener. I hope everything is going well. I hope this podcast reaches you and you're in good health and you're safe. And I think that does it. I don't really have anything else. John, you've got anything else?
No, just to reiterate, thanks for listening, everybody, and everybody stay safe and healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. Ditto. So that does it for today's episode. If you are interested in more History Respawn content, you can reach us at www.historyrespawn.com. And you can also check us out on Patreon, www.patreon.com/History Respawn. Until next time, goodbye.